Well, back in the 80s, there was a song out by Mac Davis. Maybe you already figure out what I'm going to say, but anyway, if you remember it, it's, "Oh Lord, it's hard to be humble." My father used to sing it a lot, and he even had a shirt with those words printed on it. And this is how it went. "Oh Lord, it's hard to be humble when you're perfect in every way. I can't wait to look in the mirror, 'cause I get better looking each day. To know me is to love me. I must be a hell of a man. Oh Lord, it's hard to be humble, but I'm doing the best that I can." I don't think it was something that my father would often say, so it was certainly a favorite of ours. I'm not sure if Mac Davis had those words in mind when he was thinking of the scripture from Micah, "Walk humbly with your God." That passage really says it all when it comes to instructions on what God requires of his people. Do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. It's really one of my favorite passages and one to remember as qualities that we seek in other people, or qualities maybe that other people seek in us. When I try to picture humility today, the image of Princess Di or her two sons comes to my mind as they stoop to touch a child lovingly, or Princess Di as she reached out to help someone with leprosy. They certainly set a good precedent for not only the royal family, but I think for all of us. I love to read historical fiction. I like to learn something when I'm reading. And not too long ago, I read a book by Michelle Moran called Cleopatra's Daughter. The love and marriage of Mark Antony and Cleopatra had an earth-shaking political impact. Both were feared and hunted by the Roman powers. The two lovers chose to die by their own hands as Octavian swept into Egypt to conquer that land. The story is actually about the 10-year-old children, twins, of Mark and Cleopatra. The girl was called Selene, and the boy was Alexander. And they were taken in chains to Rome after the death of their parents. And though they had been raised in luxury, their future was threatened by the whims of the reigning rulers. They viewed the injustice of Rome with horror. Selene especially took to heart what was happening around her. She gave up some special beads to save the life of a slave girl. She viewed unjustly the court sentence to kill 200 slaves just because one of them was guilty of murder. She watched in horror as unwanted babies were left at a place called Columna Lactaria, where people would leave their children. And if they were lucky, someone would come along and nurse them, or maybe somebody would come along and adopt them. But often they were just left there. And eventually, Selene raised enough money for a home to care for all these children. She also had to face the death of her brother Alexandra when he was caught with his homosexual lover. Imagine all this taking place only 25 years before the birth of Christ. No wonder Micah felt compelled to write what he did. God didn't want people to please him with burnt offerings of calves, gifts of rams, oils, or the offering of their first child. All he wanted was his people to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with their God. Micah's teaching emphasized that outward expressions of being religious had little value if their actions didn't show God's love. Sunday worship is not worth much if it doesn't make a difference on what we do on Monday morning. Each day, I like to start my day by reading from the upper room. I know Heather was looking for the daily bread. There's lots of devotions to use. But one really stuck in my mind. It was the story by a man named Roland Rink. And he was from Gauteng, South Africa. And this is the story he shared. In my country, South Africa, June 16th is a public holiday called Youth Day. And on this day, more than 30 years ago, young people of Soweto, a black township, peacefully demonstrated against the oppression of apartheid. Many lost their lives. Some were as young as 12 years old when the demonstrators were attacked. They found it difficult to imagine a future of peace and hope where they lived. And yet in 2010, we watched as the national teams in the World Soccer Tournament. Seeking justice was actually possible. And I find it very difficult to watch some of the demonstrators today, especially in Hong Kong, where people are being beaten just for doing what they believe in. You hope and you pray that there will be justice. This is certainly a reversal of what God had intended for his people. In our New Testament lesson today, Jesus is pointing out a reversal in how God views people compared to the example viewed by the Pharisees. Two men go into a temple to pray. One is a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisees were regarded as very devout religious people in the first century. They believed in following the religious laws very strictly. They were also very hypocritical, distancing themselves from those that they felt were inferior to them. And in the temple that day, the Pharisees' prayer was only an offering to God of how pure a person he was. The tax collector was at the opposite end of the social strata, collecting revenues for Rome and often cheating other people. However, Jesus views the Pharisee as a person who is reflecting on himself and not on God. He has pride for himself and contempt for others. The tax collector approaches God with honesty, acknowledging his sin and seeking God's grace. Jesus proclaims to the people listening that it was the tax collector who went home justified, that God does forgive and God does love all his people. The tax collector was made himself right with God as he humbled himself. I don't know, in contemporary music, there is a song called Humble Yourself in the Eyes of the Lord, and he will raise you up higher and higher. He will raise you up. In God's reign, those who think that their high ranking will carry them through to God's reign are mistaken. Humble yourself. God will raise you up higher. I remember a very humbling experience that I had several years ago. I was with another woman, and I think there were 3 of us, and we went to the Thorough Detention Center to offer a worship service for the fellas there. 3 of the gentlemen came down. Not always, many came down, sometimes 10, but that day there was 3 of us, plus the 2 of us who were volunteering. And that day, one of the ministers, the local ministers, came in to offer communion to the 5 of us. And as we stood in front of the minister to receive the elements, I looked up into the eyes of the other 3 men, and I realized that as God viewed us, he didn't view us as 2 different types of people. He only viewed us as 5 people seeking God's healing and God's grace. I was no better than they were. And it was just humbling to think that that's how God looks at us. individually and for what we have to offer. Perfect humility is shown when we submit ourselves to do the will of God in our lives. From James 4, God resists the proud, but grace to the humble. So then submit yourselves to the will of God. Being open to all God's children enables us to meet people we've never met before. It enables us to hear stories from lives we've never heard. All it takes is sitting down and talking with somebody, and you find amazing things about other people, other places that they've lived, and other journeys that they've taken. Several years ago, there was a story in the local paper in Niagara Falls, and it told the story of a man who found it hard to be humble. One day, a lady in a faded gingham dress and her husband, dressed in a threadbare suit, walked timidly into the office of the president of Harvard University. They had no appointment, and when they asked to meet with the president, they were turned down many times. But finally, the stern-faced president approached the couple. The woman explained that her son had attended Harvard, but was killed accidentally. They wanted to erect a memorial to their son on the campus. The president responded very gruffly, "We can't put up a statue to every son who had ever attended this university." The mother replied that she wanted to give a building to Harvard. The president replied, "They have over 7.5 million in buildings at Harvard. He couldn't imagine what these people could offer to him." Mr. and Mrs. Leland Stanford got up from that meeting and traveled to Palo Alto, California, to establish the university that still bears their name, Stanford University, a memorial to a son that Harvard no longer cared about. Humbling ourselves opens our hearts to showing kindness to others. Sometimes it means meeting wonderful people who we have never had the opportunity to meet. The movement of random acts of kindness was started by Ann Herbert in 1982 in Sausalito, California. She actually scrawled these words on a placemat: "Practice random acts of kindness and senseless acts of beauty." From there, it spread to appearing on bumper stickers. Radio stations recited incidents when people actually went out of their way to do something kind for someone else. And in 1993, a book was even published telling of the many acts of kindness that people had performed. And in 1995, in Denver, Colorado, February 17 was declared Random Acts of Kindness Day. People paid forward the cost of a cup of coffee at Tim Hortons. Some actually paid for the dinner of other people who were eating in the same restaurant. And that actually happened to us. My father and my, Alberta, do you have something? Yeah. Very good. Yeah, and it really humbles you to think that someone would take that time to do it. We couldn't figure out who had done it, but it really was. It's really a very nice thing that people do. I read Women's Day, and every month or every week there's something that someone has done. I think one of my favorite is the little boy who gets out his piggy bank and empties it and asks his mother to take him to Tim Hortons so that he can pay for the coffee of someone else. I honestly believe we're really training our younger children in some of these wonderful acts. And maybe they'll show more kindness maybe than some of the people today. And often even Jesus would do something and he'd say, "Don't tell anybody what I've done." I think he was afraid the officials would have come after him. A couple of years ago, when you talk about random acts of kindness, my daughter and I took her children to a play in Toronto called The Railway Children. I don't know if anybody else saw that, but it was adapted by a story written by Edith Nesbit. And it was the story of a mother and her children who were forced to move from their elegant London home to a very small town. The children found nothing to do, so they would go down to the railway station and greet some of the passengers as they got off the train and get to know them. And they became a great help to other people. They helped a young lad with a broken leg. They helped a Russian man find the family he was looking for. And one day, they even alerted a train before there was an accident, before the trains had crashed, and they were declared heroes. And fortunately, of course, the story ended with a happy ever after, and they were rewarded for all their goodness. And lastly, humbling ourselves awakens us to the needs of others in our own community and around the world. It makes us aware that many people are treated unjustly. We hear about people with disabilities needing welfare because it's hard for them to find a job. We hear of the discrimination toward people of the LGBTQ communities. We know that proper housing and clean water are not available to our Indigenous brothers and sisters. And lately, we watch as families are separated from each other. Refugees, all they need is a home, a place to call home, and they're not being given it. I just find it so sad when you see a prison-like atmosphere and little children behind it. All they want is to find their family. Many groups do offer a lot of help, and we hope that the money that is saved, and I know the grandmothers spend a lot of money sending money to grandmothers in Africa who have been left to look after grandchildren when families have been hit with the AIDS virus. And those are wonderful things. We all have a kind heart, and we just hope that all the money gets to where it is going and where it is needed. In the words of Amos 5:24, let justice roll down the waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Let it be so, God. Let it be so.